You've given us a really fascinating collection of articles and thoughts, and today we're just going to jump straight into a deep dive, exploring some really fundamental questions.
Sounds good.
We're going to be looking at what makes society stable, how technology is, well, shaping what it means to be human, our pretty intricate relationship with energy and the environment,
Mm.
and even how our, ancient instincts play out in the modern world. It's a lot to unpack,
It
really.
is, yeah.
And our mission basically is to extract the key insights so you come away with a clearer, more connected understanding of these big topics.
Exactly. It's about taking these diverse perspectives, these different sources, and kind of synthesizing them into actionable and thought-provoking takeaways.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is seeing how these seemingly separate areas actually, weave together in some surprising ways.
Okay, so let's start by looking at one of the ideas you sent over. It tries to define a kind of fundamental equation for understanding societal stability. It's referred to as variable y.
Yes, variable y. And in its simplest form, this variable y represents the balance, basically, between consumption and investment. But the key insight here, I think, is that this very basic relationship actually plays out at every level of society.
Every level.
Yeah, from your personal budget to a family's finances, a company's balance sheet, and crucially, the government's budget. It's really all about how resources are allocated across all these different scales.
Right, and as populations grow and our societies become, well, more complex, the number of these accounts that need to be factored into the Y equation also increases, doesn't it? Potentially reaching like hundreds.
Hundreds, yeah.
But how do we even compare the actual consumption of goods and services within such a complex system?
Well, that's where the crucial role of currency comes in, you see. It acts as this common reference point that makes real consumption comparable across all those different levels.
Okay.
That's why understanding monetary policy, like how governments manage the supply of money, as well as things like exchange rates and the correlation of savings, they're all so important. And almost as a byproduct of this whole dynamic, we get inflation.
Inflation, the thing that always seems to be chipping away at our buying power. Can you explain that connection a bit more?
Absolutely. Inflation, it arises when the way resources are allocated and the economic policies put in place by various players, including the government, aren't really in line with the actual availability of goods and services.
Okay.
People accept what we call fiat currency. That's essentially money that isn't backed by a physical commodity like gold, right, as a representation of real value. But if too much currency is circulating and, when people try to exchange it for goods and services, the supply of those things just doesn't keep up.
Yeah.
Well, you get an imbalance, and that leads to inflation.
Interesting. So this Y equation, by taking all these variables into account, it helps us gauge whether a society is like leaning towards stability or instability. But what exactly does stability mean in this context?
Well, in this context, stability essentially means that the needs for consumption are being met and resources are being allocated in a way that avoids major conflicts. People tend to feel a degree of satisfaction with crucial aspects of life, like pensions, education, culture.
Right.
And they develop a sense of being a citizen within that society. The more readily available these resources are, the greater the tendency towards social stability, generally speaking.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. One of the sources also mentions a fundamental equality between energy supply and demand. How does this tie into the Y equation and, overall societal stability?
This is a really key piece of the puzzle. The supply of energy, it's defined as the aggregate productivity of a society multiplied by the energy sources available to it. And it's important to remember that these sources can be imported. Okay.
Yeah.
On the other side, we have the population with its age structure and other factors like knowledge and even what they call meditative capacity.
Meditative capacity.
Yeah, which influence the demand for energy and the potential for distributive conflict. The fundamental equation here is basically productivity times energy sources equals population times distributive conflict.
Wow.
Essentially, a stable society needs to ensure its energy production keeps pace with its population and the way resources are distributed.
Yeah.
Any imbalance here can lead to instability.
And what about this concept of net energy that was mentioned?
Net energy. That's a crucial concept when we analyze different energy sources. It represents the amount of usable energy we get back compared to the amount of energy we had to invest to access that source in the first place. Things like exploration, extraction, processing.
Right, the EREI.
Exactly. Energy return on energy invested.
Yeah.
So the higher the net energy of a source, the more viable it is for, well, sustaining a society.
Okay, so societal stability seems to be intrinsically linked to this really delicate dance between resources, consumption, energy, and a society's ability to allocate all that efficiently and, well, fairly.
Exactly. And now let's maybe shift our focus quite dramatically to a more philosophical perspective.
Yeah?
That of Martin Heidegger and his rather somber warning about the era of technology.
Ah, Heidegger. Yes, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century with a pretty distinctive view on the future of humanity. The source describes him as leaving behind a somber warning.
Yes, but it's important to understand that this isn't some, like, mystical prophecy he's laying out.
No.
No, it's a deep analysis of our own being and the path we've chosen, driven largely by technology. Heidegger saw something that he believed most people were, well, ignoring, and it's something that's arguably still unfolding today.
And what was that something he saw?
Heidegger developed this concept of the era of technique, or Gestel in German.
Yeah.
You can think of it as the dominant mindset where everything, including nature and even ourselves, is seen primarily as something to be ordered, controlled, and made efficient.
Like resources in a factory.
Almost exactly like that. Like everything is just a resource in a giant factory. For Heidegger, modern technology isn't just a set of tools. It fundamentally transforms the way we think, feel, and exist. There's been a really drastic shift in our relationship with nature.
From something sacred to just another resource to be exploited.
Precisely. In the past, nature was often viewed with awe, maybe as a mystery to be understood. But with technological advancement, we've increasingly come to see the world as something to be explored, dominated, and ultimately used for our own purposes. Heidegger argued that this mindset, this Gestel created by modern technology, leads us to treat everything, from the natural world to other people, as mere means to an end.
Nothing has intrinsic value anymore.
Only utilitarian value. How can it be used? Nothing has value just for being.
And this leads to that prediction that humanity would lose its own identity, doesn't it? That idea really stuck with me.
Exactly. In the era of technique, even human beings cease to be individuals with inherent worth and depth. We become just cogs in a larger technological system. But that was only the first part of Heidegger's prophecy.
Oh, there's more.
Yes, he believed that as we become increasingly dependent on technology, we actually lose our capacity for reflection on what it truly means to be human. For him, the greatest threat wasn't physical destruction like nuclear war or something.
No.
No, but the loss of our very essence. For Heidegger, being was something profound, a connection to existence that went beyond mere logic and rationality.
And that connection has been lost in the modern world, according to him.
Pretty much, yeah. It's been replaced by a superficial, utilitarian way of thinking. People have stopped asking fundamental questions about who they are, and have become primarily concerned with what they can do and what they can consume.
Right.
The result, according to Heidegger, is a society that's increasingly alienated, lost, and disconnected from itself, basically living on autopilot without questioning the meaning of their lives.
And the really somber part is that Heidegger thought this process might be irreversible, right? An existential apocalypse, as the source puts it.
Yes. He feared that we would end up becoming something that could no longer truly be called human, completely absorbed by the technological system, living only to produce, consume, and survive, with no space left for reflection or spirituality or any search for deeper meaning.
Wow.
And what's perhaps most disturbing is that he believed we would accept this without resistance, just go along with it.
It's quite striking how this vision, written decades ago, seems to resonate so much with our present, doesn't it? With our relentless pursuit of technological progress, innovation, economic growth.
Heidegger saw this kind of progress as a potential trap. Instead of liberating us, technology might actually be imprisoning us in a cycle of constant acceleration and increasing dependence. We think we're advancing, but perhaps we're actually becoming, well, less human. Just think about the impact of the internet and smartphones on our lives.
Sure.
What was intended to connect us often fragments our attention and diminishes our capacity for deep reflection, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And artificial intelligence and automation only intensify this question, right?
Yeah,
About our purpose, if machines become more efficient than we are at so many tasks.
exactly. If the underlying logic of the modern world is efficiency, then an imperfect, emotional, and unpredictable human being can start to look like a problem to be corrected or optimized. We already see this in things like algorithmic evaluation systems, where our real identities can kind of dissolve into statistics and predictions.
But did Heidegger offer any way out? Any escape from this bleak prophecy?
Yes, he did. He spoke about the need for authentic thinking. This means recovering the ability to question and reflect on our own existence, stopping the automatic way of living, and relearning to ask what it truly means to be human, what we're losing as we become so reliant on technology.
So the solution wouldn't be to, like, abandon technology altogether, smash the machines.
No, not necessarily. It's more about fundamentally changing our relationship with it.
Okay.
To stop seeing everything solely as a resource to be exploited, and instead recognize that things, including ourselves and the natural world, have their own inherent meaning and value, separate from their usefulness to us.
And how do we do that?
Well, he suggested it begins with each of us individually, reclaiming time for reflection, seeking out authentic human experiences, and challenging the blind acceptance of everything that technology imposes on us.
The crucial question, as the source so aptly puts it, is whether there's still time to change this trajectory before we start thinking like machines ourselves. A really profound thought to carry with us.
It really is.
Okay, now let's shift gears again and dive into the energetic theory of the hominin. It sounds like we're moving back to a more, well, fundamental level of analysis.
Yes, this theory offers us a different lens through which to understand human existence and civilization, and it's based on a central equation, V-E-H-Y.
E-E-H-Y.
Which stands for productivity, V, times energy sources, E, equals population, H, times distributive conflict, Y. Essentially, what this tells us is that a stable society needs to ensure its energy production keeps pace with its population and the way resources are distributed. Any imbalance here can lead to instability.
Okay, let's break down this equation a bit. What does each of these letters represent again?
Right, so VE represents the total energy supply available to a society. V is the aggregate productivity, and E represents the available energy sources like fossil fuels, renewables, etc.
Got it.
On the other side, HY represents the energy demand and the conflicts related to the distribution of that energy. H is the population structure size, age distribution, things like that. And Y is the GDP, the gross domestic product, which also reflects the distributive conflict or how resources are allocated within that population.
And what makes up that aggregate productivity? V, you mentioned that earlier.
Right. V is the sum of C, which stands for capital or increasingly artificial intelligence.
Ah, interesting.
And T, which represents human resources or labor. In turn, T is further divided into T1, which is intellectual labor or know-how, and T2, which is physical labor.
Okay.
And the change in productivity over time, that's delta V, is equal to the investment I that was saved in the previous economic cycle.
Phew. Okay, this is getting complex, and this investment is even more detailed, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Investment I is influenced by both public spending, G, and private spending, P, and it's allocated across various crucial areas. Think health, S, security, S2, transportation, T, housing, H, education, E, infrastructure, I. And then there's this N for other miscellaneous expenses.
Like what?
Things like research and development, leisure, culture, all that stuff. And finally, the GDP-Y is the sum of investment I plus the consumption co of all economic actors. It's a complex simplification of economic dynamics, really.
And how do the energy sources E fit into this bigger picture?
E encompasses all the forms of energy that a society can utilize. Biomass, geothermal, wind, solar, biofuels, human labor itself, hydroelectric, nuclear, fossil fuels, and more. The availability and efficiency, remember net energy, of these sources have a direct impact on productivity and, consequently, on the capacity to support the population H and mitigate distributive conflict. Y.
This energetic theory really reminds us of something fundamental that another source mentioned. The Earth existed long before us and will continue to exist long after us. We are just one part, maybe a temporary part, of a much larger ecosystem.
Exactly. Despite our perception, maybe our illusion of being somehow above or separate from nature, we are intrinsically dependent on it. We've built this whole new world using the resources it provides, but we're starting to feel the limits of that intervention, aren't we?
Definitely. That view of the pale blue dot from space, it really drives home the fragility of our atmosphere and the profound impact our actions are having.
It does. And it connects to that constant feeling you mentioned that ecological news always sounds like the end of the world. The idea that humans and nature are separate entities just doesn't hold up anymore, if it ever did.
But given that we see this deterioration, why does it feel so difficult to take meaningful action? It's baffling sometimes.
Well, one of the sources references the philosopher Spinoza, who suggested that humans don't fully comprehend the inconsistent processes that govern their conscious behaviors and thoughts. Perhaps our emotions and our, animalistic tendencies, which were advantageous in a simpler past, are now actually counterproductive in our complex modern society.
Like our survival instincts are blinding us.
Possibly blinding us to long-term threats, yeah.
So could the answer lie in our genes, in our more primal instincts? Are we truly the most adaptable species, or is that just something we tell ourselves?
We certainly have the capacity to live in extreme environments, that's true. But we also clearly have the capacity to destroy those habitats. Evolution shows us that we are, in a sense, just another species. Unique in our own way, sure, but every species is a master of survival in its own niche, isn't it?
That's a good point.
We're all made of the same fundamental building blocks, and diversity arose from natural selection over immense timescales.
And that natural selection doesn't have a utilitarian purpose, as the source points out. It's not just about survival machines. Things like art and sophistication seem to have deep evolutionary roots.
Absolutely. We are part of this system and fundamentally depend on the Earth's goodwill, so to speak, on a symbiotic relationship with everything else on the planet. Science, in this light, doesn't have to be seen as an affront to faith or spirituality. It can be seen as an affirmation of it, of our role as part of, and perhaps protectors of, this creation.
The source positions us as a kind of novelty, and maybe even a test version in evolutionary terms. We're unique in our ability to alter our ecological niche in ways that other animals can't, primarily through technology, right?
Right. From bipedalism and the discovery and control of fire onwards, the evolution of our technology has allowed us to expand our territories and manipulate the environment on an unprecedented scale. But despite our modern comforts, we can't forget our fundamental vulnerability as animals. Culture has become our life support system in a way.
Shielding us.
Yeah, shielding us from the immediate environment and allowing us to reshape it, often dramatically.
And we've inherited these survival instincts, the concern for others' opinions, the constant comparison, status anxiety that in this technology-rich environment with instant gratification everywhere can be really easily manipulated, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. Imitation is a core part of our social nature, and our primary focus of adaptation has shifted significantly from the natural environment to the cultural environment we've created. Failure to adapt culturally can lead to ostracism, which for a deeply social species like ours is historically akin to a death sentence.
Wow.
There's a real mismatch, you could argue, between our brains, which evolved to deal with the immediate dangers of the savannah, say, and the abstract, complex challenges of the modern world. This includes symbolic threats and the difficulty of balancing our fast, intuitive thinking, system one, with slower, more rational thought processes, system two.
This idea of living in an ocean of cosmic energy is quite poetic, almost mystical.
It is, isn't it? It reminds us that the future is both ahead and behind us, that everything is interconnected in ways we barely grasp. For 99.9% of our evolutionary history, we were hunter-gatherers. We lived in small, kin-based groups, directly dependent on our immediate environment. We didn't have the ability to store large food surpluses.
Which led to more egalitarian social structures.
Generally, yes. Less hierarchy, perhaps more female autonomy compared to later agricultural societies. We lived within the environment's carrying capacity because we couldn't really exceed it for long.
And then the invention of agriculture changed everything, didn't it? Creating surpluses, leading to specialization, hierarchy, and this rapid cultural evolution as a transferable system, almost like DNA passing down information.
Exactly. We began to behave more like a superorganism, similar to ant colonies or beehives, especially once we tapped into abundant material resources and, crucially, cheap energy. That abundance is historically quite unusual, remember.
Right.
In the past, a vast portion of the economy, maybe 80–90%, was dedicated just to primary energy production, meaning food based entirely on current solar energy flows captured by plants. Today, we rely incredibly heavily on fossil sunlight stored over millions of years.
The population densities we see today, billions of people, were only made possible by fossil fuels. Hunter-gatherer societies just couldn't support those numbers.
Not even close. Basic agricultural societies couldn't either, not on this scale. There's been this historically very recent shift, just in the last few centuries, from wood to coal and then rapidly to oil and gas. This was often driven by resource depletion, running out of easily accessible wood, for instance, and the sheer ease of access and energy density of these new sources. Cheap oil in early 20th century America, for example, completely transformed transportation, food production, housing.
Leading to massive rural to urban migration.
Precisely. The whole structure of society changed.
Initially, societies perhaps focused on maximizing grain stores, which allowed for population growth and territorial expansion. Now it feels like we're focused on maximizing digital financial value, doesn't it? With money acting as a kind of claim on future energy, all ultimately serving this growing superorganism.
That's a compelling way to put it. And it's become practically impossible for individuals to live entirely outside this modern dependent society. We both contribute to and rely on this superorganism for our basic needs: food, shelter, security, everything.
Which leads us to what you might call the paradox of our times.
Which is?
The unintended consequences of our seemingly insignificant individual actions. Starting one car might seem trivial, right? But billions of cars doing that collectively have a massive global impact on the climate.
Absolutely. We're like ants, maybe with more complex signaling, but our individual actions aggregate into emergent behavior that is now becoming demonstrably harmful on a planetary scale. The internet, smartphones, massive server farms consuming huge amounts of electricity. These are all examples of this unpredictable emergence. Nobody planned for exactly how these would play out.
We feel like tiny microbes on a vast planet, maybe insignificant individually, but collectively we're capable of triggering a significant response from the Earth system if we don't curb our carbon emissions. We're talking about major climate disruptions, water scarcity, food insecurity.
Right. The real question isn't whether the climate is changing. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The crucial question is how dramatically the world will alter with drastically increased greenhouse gas concentrations. We have evidence from past extinction events in Earth's history that shows how disruptive these changes can be.
And looking at the geological past, the paleoclimate record actually reinforces what climate models predict, doesn't it? A significant global temperature increase with a doubling of CO2 levels compared to pre-industrial times.
It does. And the alarming thing isn't just the amount of change, but the speed of the change that's projected. It's this rapid pace that really limits the ability of ecosystems, and indeed human societies, to adapt.
Yeah.
Climate change will inevitably exacerbate existing societal pressures, political instability, resource scarcity. It could potentially lead to serious conflicts over access to essentials like food and water, mass migrations on a scale we haven't seen before, and significant governmental instability in vulnerable regions.
It's ironic. We can look at distant stars with powerful telescopes, but we can't seem to escape our interconnected problems right here on Earth. And the solutions can't just be pushed onto the marginalized or future generations, can they?
No, absolutely not. Solutions need to be inclusive and address the systemic issues.
And even with the projected increases in global wealth over the coming decades, the big question remains whether that wealth will translate into proportional improvements in actual quality of life and happiness for most people.
That's a huge question. There's also a tendency, which is understandable, to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information about climate change and environmental destruction. This feeling of being overwhelmed can unfortunately lead to inaction or denial.
Like paralysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Paralysis. The metaphor used in one source is quite stark. It's like we're on a shrinking raft, and more people are desperately trying to get on. It illustrates the fundamentally unsustainable nature of our current trajectory if things don't change significantly.
Purpose, autonomy, effectiveness, a sense of control. These are crucial for human motivation, aren't they? And if people feel their actions don't have any real impact, they might just withdraw and maybe redirect their energy towards consumption as a kind of coping mechanism or distraction.
That's a real danger. Wallerstein's world systems theory reminds us just how deeply our industrialized tendrils reach into every corner of the globe. But it forces us to ask, what is the true effectiveness of our production if it leads to the widespread disappearance of wildlife and the degradation of the ecosystems we depend on?
There's a growing disconnect, too, from the real costs, environmental and social, associated with creating and transporting the goods we consume. These complex global supply chains obscure those costs.
They really do. And at the heart of all these transformations and movements lies energy. Energy is the fundamental capacity to do work. We wield immense power on this planet because of the energy we command, yet we remain utterly dependent on its delicate ecosystems.
Past energy transitions from wood to coal, coal to oil have always come with a cost, haven't they? Economic, social, environmental costs. And the current transition to renewables will be no different. It takes energy to build the new energy infrastructure. As the source says, energy is the currency of life.
Absolutely. Historical comparisons of energy units really drive this home. Think about the work one horse can do versus a small tractor versus a massive modern combine harvester or freight truck. The power density of fossil fuels is just staggering compared to what came before.
They offer immense power and tireless operation, true, but their detrimental effects, pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, are undeniable and increasingly severe. Our dependence is staggering. Something like 90% of the work done in the global human economy relies on fossil fuels. The average person in a developed country consumes vastly more energy daily than just the calories in their food, maybe 50 to 100 times more, depending on how you calculate it.
And there are massive investments, pension funds, institutions, entire nations' economies deeply tied to the fossil fuel industry. This creates enormous inertia, making a rapid transition to renewables incredibly challenging politically and economically, despite the significant progress being made in solar and wind technology.
We know we have a limited time window for transitioning to a low-carbon economy to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But the idea that we can just, leave fossil fuels in the ground tomorrow while maintaining anything close to our current way of life is probably naive, isn't it?
It seems highly unrealistic, yes. Solar energy, for instance, in its current form and scale, simply cannot yet power our entire global society 2047. We need profound systemic changes in how we produce, distribute, and consume energy.
Our food system itself is incredibly energy inefficient in many ways. It requires massive fossil fuel energy inputs for fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, transport, processing for relatively low food energy outputs calorie-wise. And think about the massive embedded investment in all that fossil fuel-powered agricultural machinery around the world.
And that brings us back to the concept of EROEI, energy return on energy invested. It's key. The real cost of energy is, ultimately, energy itself. How much energy does it take to get the energy? The oil industry has historically set the pace for inflation globally, and while we're not technically running out of fossil fuels in the ground just yet,
No.
well, there's still a lot down there, but it's becoming energetically more expensive to extract the remaining reserves. We have to drill deeper, use more complex techniques like fracking. So we're getting diminishing societal benefits for the energy we invest. The net energy we get from oil extraction, especially conventional oil, has been declining for decades.
Taking on debt, in a way, is like promising to pay it back with future energy, isn't it? Assuming that future energy will be available and affordable.
That's a very insightful way to look at it. And fossil fuels are fundamentally a finite resource, laid down over millions of years. The analogy used in one source, that a single barrel of oil contains the energy equivalent of years, maybe decades, of human physical labor. It really drives home how much energy wealth we've been consuming so rapidly.
There's that saying, don't eat what you won't plant. It serves as a potent reminder, doesn't it, of the need to conserve the energy we have now to invest it wisely in building the renewable energy infrastructure for the future.
Absolutely. Will future generations look back at our current levels of energy consumption as incredibly wasteful? Almost certainly. Are we, in a sense, eating all the seed corn needed for a sustainable future? It's a serious question. The levels of comfort, convenience, and mobility we've come to expect in developed nations are historically unprecedented. We probably need to fundamentally redefine our expectations and focus not just on what we might lose, but also on what we can gain in a different, perhaps slower, but more sustainable future.
The divestment argument pulling investments out of fossil fuel companies is complex, though. Simply stopping investment might just allow others, perhaps state-owned companies or private equity with fewer scruples, to buy up those assets cheaply if our fundamental consumption patterns don't change. Demand needs to change too, right?
Exactly. It's like an addict claiming they'll quit while still obsessing over their drug of choice and keeping their dealer on speed dial. Simply not investing in new fossil fuel supply isn't necessarily thinking differently if our underlying energy demands remain the same, driven by our lifestyles and economic structures.
There's a real potential, mentioned in the sources, for a forced retrocession of global city systems if cheap, abundant energy disappears relatively quickly. History offers parallels, like the decline of the Roman Empire, which was partly linked to resource constraints and the breakdown of complex trade networks.
Right. And past conflicts, ironically, have sometimes spurred rapid technological advancements, often in weaponry, unfortunately. But the current multifaceted crisis, climate, energy, inequality, seems to demand unprecedented global collective action and cooperation, not more competition and conflict.
Which brings us back to thinking. Ultimately, the problem isn't just what we think about the world, but how we think about it.
Precisely. The image of the small but incredibly powerful human brain leads us to a fascinating thought experiment posed in one source. What if everything in existence had the same inherent value? Try to imagine that.
Wow, it's hard.
It is hard because it immediately reveals that our perception of value actually comes from our own internal judgments, our own preferences, our own needs and desires. The implication is quite profound. Merely existing as a complex organism might inherently cause harm or disadvantage to other life forms. We're constantly making choices, even unconsciously, about which life we, perhaps inadvertently, prefer to impact just by living. That's a mentally and emotionally exhausting realization if you dwell on it.
Yeah, definitely. Reality exists on multiple scales simultaneously, the microscopic, the societal, the planetary, the cosmic. And we never have perfect information, do we? Which naturally leads to us navigating various layers of hypocrisy in our daily lives. We say we care about the environment, then we drive a gas car or fly on a plane.
Exactly. And then there's the short-term versus long-term thinking dilemma. That old adage, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, reflects a deep evolutionary bias. Immediate needs and rewards often override long-term considerations, even when we intellectually understand the future risks. But ultimately, our collective destiny, for better or worse, rests largely in our own hands now.
And that brings us right to the question of our identity, doesn't it? What defines us? One source suggests it's largely our desires and the principles we hold or claim to hold.
Right. Our self-concept develops largely through our interactions with others, through social comparison, and modern consumer society has, to a significant extent, encouraged us to equate material possessions with an extension of that self. Who we are is partly defined by what we own or consume.
While desire itself is probably an inherent part of being human, maybe even essential for motivation, the endless array of, say, plastic products that fuel so many of those desires. Those are certainly optional, aren't they?
Very much so. And the concept of dynamic obsolescence really highlights this. The emotional satisfaction we derive from consumption is often fleeting, designed to be temporary, driving this constant cycle of wanting more, newer, better things. It keeps the economic engine running, but does it lead to lasting well-being?
Probably not. There seems to be this persistent conflict within us between our conscious, knowledgeable selves, the part that reads the climate reports, and the powerful influence of our ancient, often unconscious drives inherited from our evolutionary past.
Think of human competition for mates, for status. It can be seen as analogous to the extravagant displays of traits we see in nature, like a peacock's tail. It might not be strictly practical, but it signals fitness or resources. Status, and the outward display of that status, seems to be a significant driving force behind much of our behavior, even if we don't like to admit it.
And marketing and advertising intuitively understand this, don't they? They skillfully exploit this deep-seated drive for social standing, as well as our desires for convenience, novelty, and ease. Think brand names, disposable items designed for single use, fast food saving us time.
Absolutely. They tap right into those primal motivations.
And these persistent plastics, as we discussed, don't just disappear when we throw them away. There is no away. They linger in the environment for centuries, break down into microplastics, and eventually find their way back into the food chain, into our water, even into our own bodies.
It's a stark example of the disconnect. There's often a clear gap between what we intellectually know or hear about environmental problems and how we actually live our daily lives. We might even derive pleasure from things that we understand on some level to be ecologically problematic.
Why is that? Why the disconnect?
Well, psychology offers some insights. We all tend to have a positive self-bias. We like to think well of ourselves. We also tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs and worldview confirmation bias. And we subconsciously reorganize information to create a sense of coherence, even if it involves ignoring inconvenient truths. Our brains are constantly creating interpretations, maybe distortions of reality. We don't have direct, unfiltered access to the world as it is.
And group identity, which was so crucial for survival in our evolutionary past, sticking with the tribe, continues to shape our attitudes today, doesn't it? Including the unfortunate tendency to blame others, other groups, other countries for problems.
Yes, scapegoating is a common psychological defense mechanism. Importantly, as one source notes, we seem to lack an innate internal mechanism to signal the artificiality or the potential long-term danger of our modern, technology-saturated environment. It feels normal because it's all we know.
We also tend to dislike living in a state of constant anxiety or cognitive dissonance. So we often subconsciously convince ourselves that the things we enjoy, the systems we rely on, the way we live, they won't really change, or the negative consequences won't really affect us.
It's a coping strategy. It also makes you wonder, as you said earlier, if we sometimes fundamentally confuse our needs with our wants, and maybe even our wants with our needs. One idea presented is that desire logically precedes need, and that what we often consider a fundamental need in modern society is actually just a stabilized, socially constructed desire that everyone has come to expect.
Like needing a car or needing the latest smartphone.
Exactly. Those weren't needs for most of human history. And there's this constant tug of war within our brains, isn't there? Between the inhibitory centers, like the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, judgment, and understanding long-term consequences, and our more primal emotional impulses that seek immediate gratification.
The candy store analogy.
The candy store analogy, yes. That immediate desire for something sweet versus the rational understanding of the long-term health implications, or the cost. The prefrontal cortex is what helps us inhibit those immediate impulses and consider the true, often hidden, cost of our actions. That mental clarity, that ability to pause and reflect, facilitated by the prefrontal cortex, is often the very first step towards changing ingrained habits.
Because uncertainty makes us revert to old patterns.
Precisely. When we're faced with uncertainty, stress, or vulnerability, we tend to revert to old, familiar patterns of behavior. And in that state, we also become more susceptible to messages that offer seemingly easy solutions or simple explanations for complex problems, which, as the source notes, can be relevant to understanding various political phenomena and the appeal of certain types of leaders as well.
And it's crucial here to acknowledge the vast disparities in wealth and security globally. For many people dealing with daily insecurity, poverty, and scarcity, short-term thinking isn't a choice. It's a necessity for survival. You can't worry about the climate in 2050 if you don't know where your next meal is coming from.
Absolutely. It's almost a symbiotic relationship sometimes, where the pressures on those at the bottom and the actions of those at the top become confusingly intertwined and reinforce unsustainable systems. There's also this deep-seated desire to be rescued that seems to stem from a widespread feeling of powerlessness in the face of huge global problems. Ecological disaster narratives, while necessary for raising awareness, can sometimes inadvertently induce fear, unhappiness, and guilt.
Which don't always translate into effective action, right? They lead to denial or fatalism instead.
Exactly. And we have this tendency psychologically to place ourselves before the disaster, imagining we still have a clear choice about whether or not it happens. But the reality is, for many aspects of climate change, we're already well into the what now stage. How do we adapt? How do we mitigate the worst?
There was definitely an initial wave of pessimism associated with climate science in the early days, and it's a natural human tendency, perhaps, to hope that those who deny the severity of the situation might actually be correct, simply because the alternative feels so overwhelming and frightening.
It's easier to hope they're wrong. There's a compelling anecdote shared in one source about a U.S. congressman who initially denied climate change, largely for political reasons aligned with his party. But he later changed his stance quite publicly after his own son expressed deep concern about the future. It highlights how personal impact, especially concern for the next generation, can sometimes cut through political polarization.
That's powerful. It also reminds us that simply providing more scientific information, more data, more charts isn't always enough to convince people, is it?
No, it often isn't. There are vested interests, industries that actively profit from sowing doubt and misinformation. And then there's the huge issue of group identification. Is this information coming from my tribe or the other tribe? If it's perceived as coming from the other side, people may reject it regardless of the evidence, just to maintain their group identity.
It's almost as if climate science is sometimes presented or perceived as a kind of secular religion requiring belief, rather than as a body of evidence, data, and interpretation that people should evaluate through the lens of their own values, whether those values are economic, ethical, or even religious, like a personal sense of stewardship towards creation.
That's a very important distinction. While science can certainly be wrong about specific details and is constantly evolving, its fundamental strength lies in its process. Its commitment to transparency, open access to data where possible, and the core principle of falsifiability, the idea that scientific claims must be testable and potentially provable false. That's how it self-corrects and progresses over time.
Throughout history, science has forced major revolutions in human thought, hasn't it? Overturning the idea of an Earth-centered universe, challenging the notion of human exceptionalism from the rest of the animal kingdom. Perhaps the current moment requires another such shift, overcoming our collective arrogance, our ingrained individualism, and our egocentrism in our relationship with the planet itself.
That seems to be a central theme emerging. Ecology, remember, derived from the Greek oikos, meaning dwelling or home. It's fundamentally the study of the interconnected relationships within Earth's dwelling, And the crucial aspects of this dwelling are its lack of rigid boundaries, its constant state of flux and change, its inherent intimacy, everything affects everything else, and its permeability. Things flow across supposed borders.
So when we talk about sustainability, it forces us to ask, what exactly is it that we wish to sustain? The current economic system, a particular standard of living, biodiversity, a stable climate.
Those are the critical questions. And philosophy isn't just abstract thought confined to university departments. It's embedded in everything we create in the physical world. Our cities, our technologies, our economic systems all reflect underlying philosophical assumptions about value, purpose, and our place in the world.
We humans seem to have this innate tendency to create meanings, stories, and characters, heroes and villains, to make sense of the often chaotic world around us. This is powerful, but it can also lead to a narrative of exception, can it? Where individuals or groups feel somehow removed from the problem, perhaps by blaming large corporations or other countries, while overlooking their own contributions and complicity within the larger system.
Yes, that's a common trap. While there are certainly valid and important criticisms to be made of capitalism, particularly its modern form, it's also worth noting, as one source does, that it perhaps taps into an underlying, evolutionarily ancient, efficient collecting instinct that's present throughout nature. Think of a wolf pack operating strategically to secure resources with the least energy expenditure. In a way, maybe capitalism can be seen as a powerful organizing principle, a service of this larger human superorganism, driving innovation and resource extraction for better and for worse.
Energy scarcity, or competition for energy resources, has historically been a significant driver of conflicts and wars. And the concept of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, the natural tendency of energy to flow from concentrated to dispersed, less useful states, reminds us that a perfectly efficient, closed-loop ecological machine designed to recapture all lost energy is physically impossible. There will always be waste and dispersal.
That's a fundamental physical constraint. However, we also can't simply assume that humans always make optimal, rational choices in their energy collection or resource management strategies. The persistent realities of poverty, devastating environmental damage like climate change, and recurrent wars clearly demonstrate that we often don't. Our choices are complex, influenced by culture, politics, short-term pressures, and imperfect information.
And individuals, communities, even nations whose livelihoods and economies are deeply tied to particular industries, especially fossil fuels, will naturally resist changes that threaten their economic survival and way of life. It's not necessarily malicious, it's often self-preservation.
Absolutely. The idea of a truly free market operating entirely without regulation is likely a fallacy anyway. Historical experience suggests that such a system would probably tend towards monopolies, instability, and be driven primarily by short-term demands and profit motives, potentially ignoring longer-term social and environmental costs.
And our own societal short-term focus is often driven by very personal, immediate needs, like wanting access to cheap fuel to get to work or heat our homes, and also by powerful institutional pressures, like the legal requirement for pension funds to maximize financial returns for their beneficiaries within relatively short time horizons. It's not just external forces dictating things.
No, we're all embedded in these systems. It does raise the important question, though, of why political and economic leadership didn't anticipate the looming energy and climate crises more effectively and act more decisively sooner. It really highlights the ongoing need for a fundamental shift in perspective, away from purely short-term thinking. The anecdote shared about governments continuing to subsidize flood insurance for properties built in known floodplains perfectly illustrates this collective failure to adequately prepare for predictable, even inevitable consequences.
There's still a significant lack of transparent accounting, isn't there? For the full environmental and social costs associated with burning fossil fuels, the health impacts of air pollution, the costs of climate-related disasters, the loss of biodiversity. Markets will inevitably function very differently, perhaps leading to different investment decisions and consumption patterns once these true costs are more accurately reflected in prices through mechanisms like carbon pricing or stricter regulations.
That seems highly likely. A future with more distributed energy generation, like widespread solar panels on rooftops, community wind projects, microgrids could also potentially mitigate some of the geopolitical drivers of large-scale conflict that have historically been associated with centralized control over fossil fuel resources.
It's worth remembering the meaning of our own species name, Homo sapiens, wise man, wise human. There's an urgent need now to live up to that name, to truly understand our underlying motivations, our biases, our dependencies, and the true price and energy, environmental damage, and future risks of the way we currently live and consume. Many of our past societal decisions about how to organize ourselves, how to produce food, how to build cities, might not have been made with a full understanding of their long-term consequences. We didn't always know the environmental impact of fertilizers or the climate effects of CO2.
That's true. There was genuine ignorance in the past. But we know a lot more now, and we're also getting a deeper scientific understanding of how specific actions, experiences, and even information exposure trigger particular brain activity and associated desires or emotions. This growing knowledge suggests, perhaps optimistically, that we might be able to intentionally tap into these neurological mechanisms to cultivate desires and values that are more aligned with the long-term well-being of other life forms and the planet as a whole. Shift what we want.
How would that work?
Well, if we start thinking about the universe not just as a collection of objects, but as a constant flow and transformation of energy, it can radically shift our perspective on what it truly means to be alive, what our connection is to everything else. It emphasizes the need for a more strategic, holistic, and perhaps even ethical approach to planetary energy use, managing these flows for the benefit of all life, not just maximizing short-term human consumption.
The concept of emergence comes up again here, doesn't it? Reminding us that complex, unpredictable phenomena arise from interactions at different scales. Perhaps, as one source suggests, we don't just need access to energy 24/7. Maybe we need constant access to certain feelings, connection, purpose, belonging, empathy to navigate this complexity wisely.
That's a fascinating thought. It suggests that addressing the emotional and psychological dimensions is just as important as the technological or economic ones. It also implies that it's crucial we approach each other with less condescension and tribalism when discussing challenging issues like climate change, and focus instead on finding practical solutions that actually work within different social, cultural, and economic contexts. What works in one place might not work in another.
The evolution of complex moral emotions in humans, things like empathy, compassion, fairness, guilt, has been absolutely vital for the development of large-scale cooperation, which is arguably our species' greatest superpower. Understanding these emotions, their origins, and how they function today is essential for truly understanding the human condition and navigating the collective action problems we face.
Absolutely. And it's worth reiterating that the visible morphological adaptations we see in human populations around the world, differences in skull shape, skin color, hair texture, are primarily superficial reflections of our ancestors' adaptations to different environments over long periods. Things like adapting to different levels of solar radiation or oxygen levels at high altitudes, they are not indicators of some inherent essential difference in human nature or capability. We are all fundamentally the same species facing shared challenges.
Humanity's journey, viewed over the long term, is undeniably beautiful and astonishing in many ways. But we are now clearly facing significant, self-inflicted problems that demand not only new technologies, but also long-term thinking and a willingness to incorporate inherited wisdom, perhaps from indigenous cultures and older traditions, that maintained a more balanced relationship with their environment for centuries.
Yes, the Onondaga Nation Council tradition, mentioned in the sources, of explicitly considering the impact of their decisions on the seventh generation on the distant future is a powerful example of exactly this kind of long-term perspective that seems largely absent in our current political and economic systems.
Neil Armstrong, after walking on the moon, apparently spoke of the profound feeling it gave him, not just pride, but a sense of inspiring belief in what humans can achieve when they work together, and a deep hope for humanity's future survival and flourishing. It's important to remember that we are living right now in the tomorrow of yesterday. The future isn't predetermined. The probabilities of different outcomes are constantly shifting based on the choices we make today, individually and collectively.
That's a crucial point. The world around us, our dwelling, is an incredibly complex, interconnected, and constantly agitated system of both human and non-human entities, all influencing one another in countless, often invisible ways. Physical realities like the laws of thermodynamics or the ecological consequences of deforestation exist independently of our desires or political beliefs. And it's the accumulation of seemingly insignificant collective actions, billions of small choices made every day, that has brought us to this critical juncture.
Everything is part of this vast web of relationships, isn't it? And tracing those connections, even between something as seemingly unrelated as the type of paint used on a barn decades ago and the eventual emergence of widespread environmental indifference or specific health problems, is a crucial but incredibly challenging task.
It really is. Energy, in its many forms, is both the means and arguably the ultimate end of so many of our pursuits. It flows through everything, fundamentally uniting us all within the thin, fragile envelope of the Earth's atmosphere.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, the encouragement seems to be to really reflect not just on what we think about these complex issues, but how we think about them, and to seriously consider whether the most effective and lasting solutions might actually lie within ourselves in a fundamental shift in our perspectives, our values, maybe even our definition of progress in a good life.
Exactly. Even something as seemingly ingrained and simple as laziness, the desire to conserve energy, might have deep evolutionary roots. But the unique thing about humans is that we have the capacity to observe and understand these tendencies in ourselves and potentially choose to act differently.
So ultimately, the big questions posed back to you, the listener, are these. What kind of future do you genuinely want to see? What are you willing to offer to contribute time, energy, skills, resources towards creating that future? And perhaps most practically, what small, sustainable contribution can you realistically make right now that aligns with your own profession, your hobbies, your local community, and your relationships with others?
It's about finding your leverage point. Remember that each individual is unique and possesses their own distinct gifts, strengths, and spheres of influence that can be directed towards building a better future, not just for themselves, but for their children and for generations yet to come.
To end, perhaps, with those evocative words attributed to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. After mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. A powerful thought.
Indeed.
And that brings us to the end of another deep dive. We've journeyed through the intricate connections between societal stability, our complex relationship with technology, the fundamental role of energy, and our own evolved human nature. We really hope you've had some aha moments along the way, encountered some surprising facts or perspectives, and that you're leaving feeling well-informed, but hopefully not completely overwhelmed. Our aim is always to connect you, our listener, with knowledge in a clear and hopefully engaging way.
Exactly. What's truly fascinating, I think, is recognizing the sheer complexity of these interconnections, how each of these aspects, society, tech, energy, human nature, profoundly influences all the others in a constant feedback loop.
Absolutely. So as you navigate this complex web in your own life, the societal needs around you, the constant influence of technology, the energetic realities we all face, perhaps the most crucial question for you to ponder now, prompted by this dive, is in your own life, what small but sustainable shift, maybe just in your thinking or perhaps in your actions, could contribute, even in a tiny way, towards a future that feels both stable and, well, truly human?
An excellent question to take with you. Food for thought.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your sources with us, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.